Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK radio network.
Hello, this is Philip Kinsella, and you're listening to the Paranormal UK radio network, the UK's biggest paranormal network, and this is Paranormal Dimensions with David Young.
Hello, welcome to the show. Thank you for that intro, Philip. I'd like to introduce today's guest, Diane Tessman, with an outline bio which I'm sure you will agree with me when you hear it. Sounds absolutely fascinating. In the mid to late 1970s, she was a field investigator with the Aerial Phenomena Research Organisation, APRO, and Florida State Section Director for MUFON, but her work on the UFO puzzle began when she was just 4 years old, when she was abducted twice by UFO beings in 1952-53. She says that she has always had few conscious memories from those experiences. The most vivid memory is that her guide, head of abduction crew, in brackets, said, "We are from your future." She knew he might have been lying, but her investigations, research and subsequent experiences indicate he was not. After many decades, she has now reached a point of certain knowledge that at least some UFO occupants are future humans. She has therefore written Future Humans and the UFOs, Time for New Thinking. It was published February the 1st this year by Philip Mantle's Flying Disc Press. She goes on to say that one of her own encounters was aboard what appeared to be a starship. Another encounter was in a cabin on Eagle Lake, Ontario. A membrane in her mouth was taken from her on one of those encounters. She always jokes that she wants it back. In 1981, at age 34, she underwent hypnotic regression with Dr. R. Leo Sprinkle at the University of Wyoming, and she remembered many details of her childhood encounter. She has always had specific conscious memories too. She has written 5 books over the years before her brand new book, as mentioned before, Future Humans and UFOs. She has an exciting but relatively unusual life. She taught first grade English for 11 years at St. Thomas, Virgin Islands and Florida, where she raised her daughter. She lived in Southern California for 8 years and then moved to Ireland for 5 years, which was an experience of a consciousness never to be forgotten. She studied Celt shamanism while living in rural Kilkenny. She then lived near Giant Rock in the Mojave Desert of California for 2 years of research and contact there, 1995 to 1997. This was where George Van Tassel met the ETs with crowds of people cheering. She has worked with hundreds of abductees and experiences for 38 years. She is also a founder and director of Star Network Cat Sanctuary and Wildlife Refuge in her native Iowa, established 22 years ago to give a warm, good home to stray abandoned cats, supported by donations from people who enjoy her writing on both science and spirit over these many years in books and publications. So a warm welcome to Diane Tessman. Hello, Diane, and welcome to the show.
Hi.
Hi, lovely to speak to you.
Pleased to talk to you.
I know there's so much more to say on all of the outline bio I've just read out, so Diane, so would you like to start with your earliest memories?
Oh, yes, I'm pleased to be here. My earliest memories? I had an encounter at age 4. That's one of my early memories. And a second one probably when I had just turned 5. I grew up in Iowa, in North Iowa, until my parents moved to Florida when I was 10. So I became a teacher eventually. I taught for 11 years. And as my bio says, ESL, English is the second language, in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, and Florida. And so my first encounter had always It's the one I remembered under hypnosis with Dr. Leo Sprinkle.
Right.
Who is still a good friend. He's 88 now.
Wow,
and
he is. Yeah.
So he subscribes to my newsletter, and I hear from him about once a month. And I got him in the book. And so that encounter is the one that I remembered details of. But I've always had conscious memories that not very many. But one of them was that the being I met, who seemed like a man, human, except for his eyes, which were amber colored and almost translucent like. So, you know, I wondered about artificial intelligence, and I've never quite understood why his eyes seemed not in the human genome to me. At age 4, I just knew what people looked like, and he sure did, except for his eyes. But he said to me, and I've always remembered this, "We are from your future." And so when I went into UFO investigation for a couple of years with MUFON and APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, it was when I was teaching, so I didn't investigate that many cases, but a few, and I tried to look at it scientifically, and I would read, you know, books. Brad Steiger was an early favorite, and he later became a friend. He and
really?
his wife Sharon.
Yeah, I remember reading a few of his books in my early days.
Well, they live nearby. He died recently, but was another Iowan. And so then eventually I went into the more spiritual side of investigation and being an experiencer. But my new book, UFOs and the Future Humans, pardon me, I got the title wrong.
Yeah.
Future Humans and the UFOs.
I'll cut that bit out later, don't worry. No.
But that blooper reel is an attempt at being objective and scientific and applying that side of my UFO investigation all these years. I don't put forth this idea just because this being that I encountered said so. He could have been lying. I could have been a shapeshifter from goodness knows where. But my investigation throughout the years and experiences and logic tell me that we need to take a second look at UFO occupants. I think we leap to the conclusion that they're extraterrestrials.
No, I fully agree with you. I think a lot of it, as I've mentioned on this show many times, I think a lot of it is interdimensional. You know, I don't know if you probably do agree with me to a certain extent.
Yes, and of course time is the fourth dimension, so that kind of overlays. I always think of two quotes that I really like. Jacques Vallée, who's in my book, there's one of his research papers is published in the book. He said such travelers could manifest simultaneously, which, you know, sounds other dimensional too, throughout what appears to us as different periods in our history. They can be from anywhere and any time and could even originate from our own Earth. And of course, Jacques Vallée has always kind of maintained that with these sort of variations on who and where. He's mentioned even fairies and that kind of earth spirits.
Oh, yeah.
But it could also be advanced technology beings that made their way here through technology rather than being of Earth. The other quote that I want to start off with is Arthur C. Clarke: "Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic." And so I think we have felt that ETs are so advanced as to be almost magical. We assign them a lot of credit, and we sort of overlook ourselves And I don't think that benefits us as a species.
Sure,
we
yeah,
don't
I think
really,
you're right. I mean, I think we're capable of a lot more than we actually think we are.
well, we're in kind of a rut currently, or we took 2 steps backwards. There's a lot of problems, but we either go on or we don't. And, I'm not really denying that extraterrestrials don't visit Earth. I'm not entirely sure, but yes, they probably do. And certainly there are thousands of advanced ET races across the galaxy. But I think we've ignored that it is our own descendants who are in most or all of the UFOs. This is a golden age of science and technology currently. We may not stop to realize that fully. But computer science, they say 5 years in computer science is equal to 200 years of past progress. Astronomy, we have telescopes that can see Earth-like planets and other star systems so far away. Quantum physics, biomedicine, neuroscience, genetic science, and I think that we took, the future humans, we took advanced forms of all that we're now laying as a foundation. Their society reflects this, and we are their forefathers and foremothers who opened the windows on advanced knowledge. We're a step behind spiritually. Our species is, and I think they're still a step behind spiritually. Abductions are inhumane, things like that. I'm not making excuses for. I just think it's logical that we consider time travelers who are us.
So when do you think we may conquer time-space travel? Or do you think it's a long way in the future, or maybe a matter of 100 years or so?
Yeah, it could be 50, 75 years, 100 years. Once you conquer time travel, you find the key. You can go back to any time. So it's, it could be a few thousand years. In my book, Dr. Sarfati gives his post-quantum low-power warp theory that he feels explains the tic-tac behavior perfectly, and that may be the key, but it may not be. The chapter in my book is, I think, pretty interesting of his, and he's been a very brilliant physicist, non-conforming in many ways, but it may take a bit of non-conforming to, Einstein never said time travel is impossible. And a lot of people will quote that and say, well, I wouldn't even consider it. Einstein said it's impossible. And he never said that. So yeah, I think he thought it was difficult to figure out.
Yeah. Well, normally you hear that anything you can think of will one day become possible. That's kind of the theory that I usually hear. I think the thing is, do you not think that the government, the secret governments and everything, that they're actually playing around with time travel and things like that already?
They are, and in fact, I'm sure they are. And we always, like you said, whether it's discovering fire or flying airplanes, we dream it. It seems to be one of the strengths of the human race. First we dream it, and we develop it, and we fall on our faces a few times, and then we've got it, and then we develop it to great advancement, like the planes we have today. And it may be something like, I always say, I don't know how accurate this is, but maybe it's something like just the aerodynamic shape of a plane for a big jet really had to be realized, that you need this shape before it could be realized. Maybe there's something in time travel that is a key, not the whole answer, that opens the doors for us.
Yeah, sure, yeah. What about like time loops and things in space? You think that might be a thing that's being used?
Yeah, when it comes to the details of time travel, I sort of joke that it's probably like the U.S. tax code book. It's probably
and the British one.
Probably very complicated. I think that these are not just individuals waltzing through the door. I think that it's probably a military or quasi-military type of group. When you think of it, there could be humans from 75 years in advance and humans from 5 million years in advance. And I would doubt they'd be in the same military unit. They might even, the ones from 5 million or 20 million might even look different. Yeah. And of course, a lot of ETs, quote unquote ETs, do look different from each other. There's different, different types of humanoid ETs. So these could be the different stages of human evolution, possibly influenced by radiation or something. That's speculative. I've got Dr. Mike Masters in the book also, Michael Paul Masters. He's a professor of biological anthropology, and he says that it's simply the direction that we're going in evolution, and not necessarily that we had a big nuclear war and our genome, changed or mutated dramatically or anything like that. But it is tempting to wonder if nuclear contamination of Earth might have changed our height as far as the small.
Some type of catastrophe, I suppose, even an accident maybe, yeah.
Yeah, could not be a war, just, things like burying nuclear waste that we do so much, that lasts 100,000 years as a half-life average. It can last even longer. And so we're leaving that to our grandchildren. Yeah.
I think it's quite an interesting concept, what you mentioned, that I never thought about it before, that time travellers, maybe coming back from 1,000 years in advance, come back and meet time travellers from maybe 500 years, and and the 500 years ones may not know about the ones that are sort of you know what I mean. Could get quite confusing, couldn't it?
If they do know about them, they probably don't work together as well as those that are just from a similar time period, a similar phase of time. It's very common. Then as far as loops, there's the, somebody will always say, well, you don't want to come back because you might, kill your grandfather or your father or yourself.
Yeah,
or your mother.
Yeah, because just by coming back, you're changing things, aren't you?
But are you? Because I learned this from Dr. Sarfati, the Novikov loop is a law of physics. Now, I guess laws of physics can change if they find out otherwise, but this is accepted. Novikov was a Russian scientist from the 1800s, and he said if you come back, you cannot change the future because what happens will always happen in the same way. You didn't
past,
kill
I think you mean the past, you mean, changing the past, yeah?
Sorry, past, future, yes.
Just in case we confuse everyone out there listening.
Yes, confusing them enough as it is. Yeah. If you do come back in the past, you can't change the future.
Right,
It's if you didn't kill your grandfather because here you are. So then there's the many worlds theory where there's alternate timelines. But you may be trapped in your original, or luckily, as the case may be, in your original timeline. That's you with a capital Y, but other yous may go off in those alternate timelines. So it's a little more complex. And nobody knows the answer to these things, not even physicists. Well, I have to try it to find out honest.
Of course, it's all theoretical. I understand that, but it's an interesting concept. But I mean, if someone comes back from the past, do you think they could actually meet themselves? I mean, can they exist in two different time zones? Do you see what I'm saying? I always thought that maybe if you came back from the future and to the past, could you actually see yourself? I don't know.
Yeah, I doubt it, but I don't know.
Because you're being in two places at once, aren't you? And it's kind of it's a funny thing to try and get your head round.
Yes, it is. In fact, much of this is a hard thing to get your head around. But, yeah, it is. I think there's only one you with a capital Y, so you might be seeing an alternate you. But I don't know. We should phone up Dr. Sarfati and see what he says.
Yeah, I guess that's possible. If you're going to different planes of existence, then it's quite possible you could run into yourself as... Yeah, I can kind of get my head around that, then I think. It's going to give me nightmares tonight.
I always revert to Star Trek episodes on things like that, but they didn't know either.
No.
So.
Well, I mean, obviously, I do believe that extraterrestrials are visiting us as well, but I do certainly think that most of it is interdimensional. And I think your theory is probably working that way as well. I guess this is parts from your book. I don't quite know which one to sort of pick on, really. What about who needs human DNA or humans or aliens? During abductions, UFO occupants sometimes take tissue samples of their catch and release human subject. Now, you say you had a tissue sample taken, didn't you, when you were young?
I did. And just to complete that paragraph that you were mentioning, an earthworm's DNA would have more in common with human DNA than most likely extraterrestrial DNA would, if they're organic beings, the ETs, because Earth formed life in a certain way. As far as my tissue sample, I had these two encounters or abductions, and I think it must have happened on the second encounter. I think I was to meet this guide or this abductor, depending on how you look at it, on the first encounter. The first one, I sat on a park bench that was like a park bench in the park in town in Iowa. And he sat about a foot away from me, and he talked to me. I don't know if it was telepathy or words. I really don't know. The second one, second encounter, my family went up to Eagle Lake, Ontario, to meet my aunt and uncle and their two boys for a family get-together. And we were only staying one overnight in a cabin on the lake. And, of course, the Canadian lakes have a lot of UFO sightings, so that's kind of interesting. A lot of UFOs seen diving into those Canadian lakes. And I was alone in the cabin, which was kind of unusual because in the morning, the first morning there, my mother tended to really keep me close. They were older parents and both loved me dearly. And I'm kind of surprised she left me in the cabin, but she was outside, I think, talking to my aunt and uncle. So there I was alone. And this same being came in the door of the cabin in kind of a hurry with dark glasses on. And he had jeans and a red checkered shirt. And this is funny because I've talked to other people that suspect it's future humans that they encountered. And two different people have said, well, one of them had jeans and a red checkered shirt. So the theory is the computer on the ship, if you ask it to go back to the 20th or 21st century, it'll just spit out jeans and a red checkered shirt for your...
I'll tell you something that's creepy there, boy, just to interrupt you. I'm wearing jeans and a red checkered shirt.
Oh, that is kind of creepy.
Sorry, I interrupted you there.
Don't call me psychic for nothing. He came in and he says, Diane, are you afraid? And I said no. And I don't know, incidentally, why I was never afraid in all of this. I was probably given something to calm me down, or I don't think I was ever upset though. So he said, do you remember me? And I said yes. And that's the last thing I remember of that. I haven't had it regressed, but it's my strong impression that that may be where the tissue sample was taken. And the tissue that it was the membrane in one's mouth that goes, that attaches your gum to your upper lip. It's just a small bit of tissue. That's just totally gone from me. And I first noticed it at about age 9 when I was just goofing around with makeup, and I thought it was a scar on the outside along the line of symmetry. But then years passed, and I thought it was kind of strange. I asked a plastic surgeon once, and he said, well, goodness, that looks like a laser scar.
Wow,
well,
really?
not in 1952. But then, about 10 years ago, it dawned on me that it actually was the inside my mouth that the membrane was missing. So it made some kind of little appearance on the outside. I mean, it's not even noticeable. But what was done was this membrane and on the inside, and it was just cleanly removed, whereas I've tried to look into mundane answers. I asked my parents, both of them separately together, what happened, and they didn't know. And Mom would have been happy to give me a mundane answer because she didn't like any of this. She didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't like my UFO interest. And so they didn't know. I asked if I hit my mouth on my trike or something, a tricycle, before I could remember, like age 2 or 3. And they said no. And I guess when babies suckle, if they're breastfed, that can be slit if the baby's having trouble getting a hold of. But they said, my parents said no, they were not told that was done. There was no indication it was done. So I always say that my experience is as valid as anyone else's, even if there is a mundane answer to that. But I've never found it. And as far as what they did with it, it's my strong impression that they wanted it for their own selfish purposes. But also, I have another tale to tell here.
Oh, yeah.
When I was 3 years old, I was apparently an unhealthy child. I remember heavy nosebleeds that would just come. I was embarrassed even then. They would just come heavily for no reason. I had a bout with strep throat, several bouts with it, and I was very skinny. And so after the abductions, at about age 5.5, I was suddenly bouncing off the ceiling, doing gymnastics and acrobats, which I continued doing well into my adulthood, and extra full of energy. And, you know, today, doctors will remove a cancer patient's tissue and weaponize or cells, work with cells, engineer cells, weaponize them and send them back into that unique patient to fight cancer. And I really wonder if I might have had childhood leukemia or something similar. It was never tested. Maybe it was just developing or something. I have no proof of that other than my huge change between 3 and 5.5 right through that time of the abductions. But, you know, I've wondered if, and I meant to mention Preston Dennett, who has appeared on many shows, has a series of books on healings by ETs. I think or time travelers. I think the abductions tend to spotlight terrible, scary things to people, but there's information the other way too. So that's a possibility. And I've been cross fingers knock wood. I've been healthy all of my life, probably above average.
I think the thing that puzzles me a little bit about when you hear about aliens or extraterrestrials or interdimensionals taking DNA samples is what they actually do with them. How much human DNA do you need? Or is it a particular person's DNA? Like, do you feel that your particular DNA was important? Maybe.
I don't know. I've wondered that, but I think in general, it makes sense that perhaps if they've become, let's think they're future humans for a minute, for an hour. I think they've become perhaps deficient in something of organic humans. Now, whether they're part artificial intelligence, but still with human human core, for lack of a better word, I would say they need whoever it is needs it, maybe on an ongoing basis, to supplement something in themselves. That's the selfish reason. As far as ET hybrids, as a sort of scientific mind, even though I've done a lot of metaphysical and channeling and all of that, I have trouble getting to how that would happen, because Mike Masters, the evolutionist in my book, says, let me just quote here from him a minute. He says the ubiquity of the many, many reports describing humanoid or human-like individuals is overwhelming. Taking into consideration their reported relative humanness, it is highly improbable that another planet with different gravity, chemistry, distance from its sun would ever develop bipedal humanoid life that would look, act, and talk so much like us, and that they would rise on a planet near enough to us to allow for mutual contact and communication. Furthermore, given the tremendously long history of the universe, it is highly improbable that such a civilization would arise at the same time as us, so much like us, but have slightly more advanced technology that also happens to be so similar to our own. And he goes on to say that our nearest relative on this planet is the chimpanzee with 98.7 of our DNA, and yet we cannot reproduce with them. So, as far as creating alien, ET and human babies through that, or hybrids, I don't know. I mean, I'm not, I personally have hesitations on that, and always have a bit.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. That it's always something I wonder about. You think to yourself, well, how many pieces of DNA do they need? So that's why you think, well, it must be certain people's DNA they need. Well, I mean, does this go back to like the Roswell crash? I mean, what are your personal beliefs in that?
Well, my thoughts, I've got in the book Dr. Leonard Stringfield's work with crash saucer victims. As far as Roswell, I'm not entirely sure. I think it was probably a future human crash rather than an ET crash.
Right, that's kind of the question I was asking. I wondered what you thought it might have been. So you think it may have been a future human crash?
Yes, and I've got the Dr. Leonard Stringfield research on, he back in the 60s and 70s, he researched, some of the crashes were in the 50s as well. Apparently there were possibly other crashes, and those bodies that were taken to Wright-Patterson of the small humanoids were humanoid. I'm looking here in my manuscript for the exact description of them. He would interview a guard, for instance, that was assigned to guard the bodies on the way to Wright-Patterson. And quite often his informant would disappear then when he tried to find him again. Oh. But I used to date Richard Hall, who was the editor of the MUFON Journal and edited UFO Evidence.
Right.
And he was a lot older than me, but I wanted to know his secrets.
Yeah. Well, you would.
Richard was a friend, and he was the confidant of Leonard Stringfield. And Stringfield and Richard were so meticulous in their investigations and such honest men. So the autopsies that Stringfield reported that were done at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio were much more believable than, for instance, the fake autopsy video of more recent years. But the guards that took them from where they crashed on several different occasions would say that they were small humanoids, that they had large heads. A couple were reported as bald, but then some had fuzzy hair on top of their head, a little bit of fuzzy hair. And their uniforms, in one case silver uniforms, had not melted in the crash, but were stuck into their body because of the heat. And in one case, a guard noticed that, goodness, one of them had a muscular chest or something, and turned out that when he got a better look, it was a female. And they were basically small humans. And when they were autopsied, you know, there were these booklets first. I had them at bought one at the MUFON Symposium of 1980 of Crash Retrieval Syndrome by Leonard Stringfield. They were all the deal at the time, and I think his work is a little bit forgotten maybe from the 1990s autopsy stuff that didn't turn out to be so true. But from the autopsies at Wright-Patterson, supposedly they had atrophied muscles, which, you know, when you think about it, we have smaller muscles than Neanderthals. We're going in that direction, especially if we keep working on computers so much.
That's true, yeah.
Which apparently they do,
yeah.
Quantum computers. And they had atrophied muscles, atrophied digestive tract, atrophied genitals, but were basically human, more than probably they would have been from some far, far distant planet. That's the Leonard Stringfield. It's in the book. I can't find it. I did that from memory, but
yeah, I think it's probably worth looking into. I think anywhere out there. So yeah, it's certainly something, an aspect that the autopsy always interests me, because I don't know if you know, but Spiros Malaris was the one who was involved in the alien autopsy, the fake one. Many of us were taken in by it, you know, when it first came out. I don't know if you were, but there are still people out there that believe it's real.
I wasn't involved in the UFO field during that time, is my excuse. I didn't have, because I was doing my own publications, and I was on the spiritual side of things, and I had my own readership, which I still do. But, you know, if they joined me in 1983 when I started my publications, they're now, and maybe they were 50, they're now 83 or 87 or something. So my readership has dwindled in my spiritual endeavors, but I really wasn't following it at that point. I just kind of withdrew and did my own thing.
Yeah. Well, I think we're all hooked onto the science fiction programs like Star Trek and X-Files and everything else like that.
Right.
And then all of a sudden this alien autopsy popped up. It was supposed to be genuine, and it looked very genuine. But of course, many of us were taken in by it, you know. But the strange thing is, there are still people, even though Spiros Malaris has come out and admitted that he did it all and everything, there's still people out there saying that he's a man in black and that he's just lying and that film's real, you know. And I find that quite amazing.
Yeah, well, people can be amazing in how far they they try to stretch something. Yeah. So, you know, I was going to mention, along with Stringfield being kind of maybe forgotten too, because it was the same subject as the more recent video autopsy that left a sour note. There was Socorro, New Mexico in 1964. It wasn't a crash, but Lonnie Zamora was a well-respected officer, patrolman, and his report helped legitimize 10 years of previous occupant sightings, which my friend Richard Hall made a list of occupant sightings, and almost all of them were of small humanoids throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, a few full-size humanoids, and one or two hairy monsters. But it's amazing how consistently the occupants have been almost human. So this Zamora sighting, he saw something in the air. He watched it in New Mexico, a flame descending in the southwestern sky. He glimpsed a shiny car-sized object on the ground about 150 yards away. Near it stood two small figures clothed in white coveralls. Zamora briefly lost sight of the object and the figures as it passed. He passed behind a hill, and then he saw an egg-shaped object standing on four legs. It displayed a peculiar insignia on its side, something like an arrow pointing vertically from a horizontal base to a half crown. The two figures disappeared. The object emitted an ominous roar, and Zamora ran back to his car, glanced over and took off, scared him. At one point, he glanced over his shoulder to see the UFO, now in the air, headed for a nearby canyon. And Project Blue Book investigators found that Zamora had a reputation for integrity, and that's an interesting case that is, again, kind of lost. I chose cases on purpose that are very well investigated. I didn't want any possibility of Photoshop or any of the newfangled stuff, but also just because time has let them be investigated more, because I was trying in my book to get across the logical idea and how obvious it is time and again, rather than really give new UFO cases. That wasn't the point of the book.
Okay, you mentioned Project Blue Book. Do you not feel that was kind of really for the public, so that they could hide all the real cases behind and just come out with cases so they could say basically they weren't real a lot of the time?
Yes, and that's been done so often. But I think with the Tic Tac, with the Navy and the Nimitz and all of that, it's gotten, I know Michio Kaku has said now it's only a matter of engineering, that this is a changing point. The Navy admits that they don't know what it is. Yeah. And I think they've kind of run out of cover-up. And so maybe disclosure is a drip of disclosure possibly has happened.
I think they've actually disclosed a lot of it anyway, because they've released, well, especially over here, they've released so many records, and if you look through those records, you can find things. But it's like I've said before, it's kind of like they're kind of like hidden a tree in a forest, you know. So if you look for things, you'll find interesting things that they can't explain. But,
well, and when you think about it, they might cover up, the powers that be might cover up the knowledge of future humans even more than ETs, because even though a lot of people embrace the ET idea and yet say that, of course it isn't future humans, that I interrupted myself and lost my chain of thought. Serves me right. That the powers that be would be afraid of the future humans, that current humans, even if the future humans didn't encourage us to follow them, people would say, well, my goodness, these people, they're us. They have the cure for cancer. They don't even get cancer anymore. All the other diseases, Parkinson's, all the bad diseases, probably gone from the human genome with advanced genetic research. And, we've done terrible things to our planet. But, my example always is that, well, artificial intelligence, could be sent in to, say, put out fires in the Amazon or Australia, the really terrible fires. There would be no loss of human life, and they would be more efficient than human firemen would. That's just a small example, but future humans must have the answers to a lot of the problems that we have caused, or they wouldn't have made it so this far, or we wouldn't have made it this far. So they're a real threat to powers that be, because people would follow them easily, in some cases, even if they didn't encourage it. So that brings us to the prime directive.
Yeah.
There must be one, for both bunch of humans' sake, both current and future, until we reach a point, and maybe we're reaching it, because they can't cover it up. Our powers that be can't cover it up so well anymore. And maybe, we're ready for it, if only because we've gotten so desperate about our planet and other problems. So maybe, there's a point where they'll just figure we're ready and take a chance. But once you know this knowledge, we as a species would never be the same again. It would probably be the biggest thing that's ever happened.
Sure. I mean, I think the feeling is that it would destroy most religions, and
right,
and because people are going to be asking questions about, well, where did the idea of gods come from, and you know, it's people are asking that already now.
I was going to say ETs would do that too, but then we don't need either time travelers or ETs to ask those questions. But we're asking them more. There's everything from there's a drop in religious attendance generally. There's also things like our sperm count is dropping by 50%. And so we're really reaching a point where we've got to know something transformational. We're kind of dwindling out a bit. But also in spirit, we don't seem to have confidence in ourselves as a species. We don't seem to think of our great-great-grandchildren. Well, sure, we love our grandchildren, but as far as thinking, back when Buzz and Neil went to the moon, the whole world stopped and watched TV screens to see them take the step onto the moon.
Me included.
And, yeah, me too. I was there in the 60s, and it was just the 60s was kind of an amazing. It seemed transformation seemed to be happening, and then got stalled for a variety of reasons, wars and drugs and everything else. But we need to find worth in our own species. We can't always wait for ET gods, and I'm not trying to replace anybody's belief in something like that, but we need to find our own worth again too, our can do. And I think it's good to reach out and not just self-examine and bicker and dicker and self this and that. We're a predator species, as Captain Kirk might say, and we need to reach out and have challenges. And if a few astronauts die, human life isn't, we're always willing to take the risk, as Captain Kirk might say, because that's why we're aboard her. I'm sorry, I slipped into Star Trek.
I think we all do that a lot. I think one of the things that interests me also is the fact that the UFOs over nuclear bases, which you mentioned in your notes here. I'm happy to get Robert Hastings on the show in a few months. He's agreed to come on, but he's been not been very well. But he's quite heavily involved in writing about the UFOs over nuclear bases. But and you put this in your notes here. And I just wonder what if you'd like to put out, to our listening public out there, what your ideas are.
Yes, well, UFOs have always been buzzing nuclear installations, whether they're where the missiles were kept, which was in 1967, I believe, was Melmont Air Force Base, and I believe Hastings has worked a lot with Captain Robert Salas, who was in charge of the Melmont base. He said on March 16th, 1967, 16 nuclear missiles became non-operational at 2 different launch facilities.
Yeah.
And he said it was early in the morning. I received a call from my topside security guard. He said that he and some of the guards had been observing strange lights flying around the site, around the launch control facility. He was asked, "You mean UFOs?" And Salas asked the guard, and he said he didn't know what they were, but they were flying around. They're not airplanes, they're not helicopters, doing strange maneuvers like the Tic Tacs. So then the missiles started being shut down one by one. Now, this Maelstrom, as I understand it, was had the technology, and then Minot, M-I-N-O-T, Air Force Base, had the actual warheads. So one by one at Maelstrom, they were shut down. He said by shutting down, I mean they went into a no-go condition. They couldn't be launched. So we get bells and whistles and a big red light on no-go. And so then at Minot Air Force Base in 1966, a year earlier, this is where the warheads actually were, and Captain Schindel, David D. Schindel, was the Minuteman Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Launch crew commander. Had the same thing happened, and the 10 ICBM warheads were went into off alert. And so there's the famous 2. Also, Loring Air Force Base in 1975 had nuclear weapons. I don't think they had missiles, but it's in Maine. I bet they might have had missiles. Anyway, they had UFOs and any number of, and then of course Rendlesham.
Yeah.
They had, Brentwater had American nuclear, something or other, missiles or weapons.
They did. Yeah.
And so time and time again, but they've also done it, UFOs have also buzzed civilian installations, like Cooper, installation that supplies power in Nebraska, had UFOs come back a couple of times and buzzed around. And when you think of it, well, the list is long and not just Cooper, but when you think about it, like this, it's on a river because nuclear installations need water intake, and as the torrential rains come and the waters rise, the Arctic and Antarctic melt, and then F5 tornadoes, like Tennessee here just got hit by, I guess it was only an F3, but it decimated part of Nashville. Yeah, what's going to happen in the future with our nuclear installations? I think future humans are trying to tell us we're just too nonchalant in our entire attitude on nukes, our radiation, and then including the waste, radioactive waste storage. It leaks. We run out of permanent places, so we store them in containers above ground. It's just we don't hear much about it, but it's really a huge mess that we're leaving to the future of the planet.
It wouldn't surprise me, actually, in the distant future, if we don't start sending it out into space.
Yeah, right. Ruin outer space.
Well, I mean, that could be another thing, the reason why we're getting visits as well from, you know, if you think along those lines. But I feel that there are some warnings coming our way from extraterrestrials or interdimensional people, because I think if you think about it, if we're damaging the world with radiation or nuclear tests and things like that, we could affect other people in other dimensions. You know, there could be a reason why we're being visited as well.
Absolutely.
But, anyway, yeah, it's an interesting concept. As I say, I'm hoping to get Robert Hastings on. I know he's not been very well over the last few months, so hopefully he'll be better. But
sorry to hear that.
Yeah. Anyway, physics and quantum physics, the technology are leaping ahead exponentially, and it seems likely that someday we'll figure out how to travel back in time. I think we kind of covered that, didn't we? But we don't. It's a matter of when, I think. Because we did say maybe 100 years or 1,000 times. I know we jumped about a bit from this list that you've given. I'm sorry.
Right. I know. I've jumped around too. Well, we haven't gone into Dr. Sarfati's low power warp that could actually give us the answer.
That's the next bit down, isn't it?
Yeah, it could give us the answer in the next few years. It would need funding and development, which is what he's very anxious to have done. I said to him, well, because he had an experience when he was 13 years old and feels his communication and some of his facts that he gets for his research are given to him by them the same way as I've said I feel I have a shared consciousness with the being I met. When he was 13, he grew up in the Bronx, I believe, Brooklyn or the Bronx. He got a phone call when he was 13 in 1952. That was the year I had my first experience. And a cold computer voice said, "We are from your future." I was going to quote it exactly here.
But was it like a computer voice, was it?
It was a computer voice, yeah. Said, "We're from your future, and you can be in a group of wonderful young people if you want to be." I didn't say wonderful. That's why I'm trying to. He'll tell me I quoted him wrong. Well, anyway, he only remembered one call, but his mother remembered many, and they harassed their phone for a couple of weeks, and she finally said, "Leave my Jackie alone," she screamed in the phone. So it's odd that he doesn't remember as many. He only remembers one. So he's been influenced throughout his life, and his interview, I said, "Dr. Sarfati, you talk low power warp. tell us about it. For starters, what about metamaterials that we hear about so much now? Metamaterials really are a huge coming thing, a new discovery that they're quantum in nature. They would, this specific metamaterial would be built into the skin of, for instance, the Tic Tacs or of a saucer, only on a nanoscale. But they create, well, I'll go to his wording here because he says, yes, it is a workable way to fold space-time, which becomes more fluid as the speed of light slows down. No one can predict when we will have this technology. It depends on the money given for research. And whether we have captured ET or post-human craft. He calls post-humans would be conscious artificial intelligence in his wording. We have need of a huge project, all sorts of scientists working together now to develop this. Right now we have this basic key. So I asked him, well, if these beings influenced you, why do you want to reach, for instance, Space Force, the American military and powers that be, to shoot at them, or why? Well, he said they wouldn't be bothered by our technology. They're still ahead, but that Russia, Iran, he doesn't want them to get a hold of it, and that there might be bad cosmic beings out there as well. So he's very anxious for us to develop this. So he says metamaterial is incorporated into the skin of the craft. In other words, it is part of the composition of the outer craft. It would be less than a nanometer thick. The Tic Tacs of the USS Nimitz and Roosevelt battle groups would likely have outer skins made of this exotic quantum material. You see, metamaterials have strange EM properties. They form a lattice work, kind of like, I believe, kind of like a beehive. Again, he may tell me that's not right. They have negative indices of refraction. It means you can send an EM field into the metamaterial. It can develop negative energy density that would cause anti-gravity. But the problem is, when you try to do this, it's just makes a weak field of anti-gravity. We would need a Jupiter-size amount of energy, and I believe that's literal, like the size of a Jupiter mass or something. But he says, there is a trick. Jack is a character too. There's a trick. When we reduce the speed of light inside the metamaterial to a very small number, space-time gets less stiff and can be warped. Why does space-time become less stiff? It happens because of Einstein. We've got Einstein here. Equation regarding the Bose-Einstein condensate, part of the theory of general relativity. It has to do with superposition. So the stiffness of space-time becomes more fluid. Refraction becomes large. The speed of light becomes small, and there is formed a zero gravity bubble around the craft. Gravity has been nullified. A very small amount of energy is then used, possibly as small as a AAA battery. So, this may not be the answer, but something like metamaterials might actually be that, like an aerodynamic structure, that one little thing that we need. And people always think of a time machine or something. Well, it's more of a formula that we need, and then the engineering of it, that's a challenge too. But we need to, he feels we can get started now so maybe disclosure is knocking also, because we are about to maybe we find it in 25 years after this developed. We don't know.
Yeah, what you mentioned about the metallic structure, that kind of reminds me again of Roswell, because they said they had very thin material, didn't they, which they couldn't destroy.
Yeah. You know, on Roswell, my joke always is, I think those were teenage drivers, because, you know, how did they manage to just crash into the desert? But then again, humans, I think, were in our adolescent years as a species. And maybe we can become mature teenagers, 19 years old soon, and have a little more sense.
I think there was some more factors involved. I think there was quite a storm going on, wasn't there? And they do say that there was the possibility that radar affected their system or something. But who knows? We really don't know that. I mean, I'm going to ask you a bit about your spiritual side as well in a minute. But before I do, time travellers probably use advanced technology to help with their abductions and stage the scenario in order to boggle the minds of their ancestors. Does this account for the Greys as well?
Well, my book goes into that the Greys could be possibly more from the future than the human-looking, like the guy I met, or Travis Walton also tells us about the golden humans that I guess the being I met would qualify as that. Almost too perfect, which might involve a tad of artificial intelligence or genetic engineering. But possibly the Greys could be from more far distant in the future, or they or some other, like I've had people say the insectoids, they're not human. In hypnosis, I remembered two beings that I had no interaction with, but like Travis's abduction, which now I came up with this before I knew of, so it wasn't suggestion from Travis's abduction. There were two small beings that stayed in the background, that one of them had sort of an insectoid. He reminded me of an Iowa grasshopper a little bit in the face. I assume it was a he, but the other one would be a more, just a large cranium, large head, small human. But the Greys and, I said insectoids, maybe some of those are ETs. Again, I'm not saying there aren't ETs. I do think humans would probably be in charge of Earth's skies, in the future. I mean, it gets very complicated because then future humans would be interacting with future ETs or time traveling ETs. It gets but I think we would control, again, a bit like Star Trek, Earth is humans. We're the sentient, species, and, perhaps we patrol both current skies, maybe that's some of the UFO sightings, and future skies. Most sightings are just sightings. They're not abductions. They're not landings. They're just going about their business. Somebody sees an odd thing go by. And so maybe, that's what they're doing, is patrolling or whatever it is they do every day.
Well, I guess, mine was that I saw one in 1966, I think it was. It was just a big oval orange object going across the night sky. And it was big, and it wasn't an aeroplane. And it was just like going past. And the funny thing was, I had this incredible feeling of knowing that something was out there. It wasn't sort of scary or anything like that. It just fascinated me from then on. But and since then, I've heard so many things about orange objects as well.
Yes. I saw my best sighting was two large, white objects, almost like full moons. This was when I was teaching school. It was 1979, and they were over Tampa Bay. I lived in St. Petersburg, Florida, and, there's the Sunshine Skyway Bridge there that connects, goes all the way across Tampa Bay. It's quite an engineering feet.
Yeah, some of those Florida bridges aren't they?
Yeah, there's a long causeway and then a high part, so that barges can go under. And at the end of that year, a barge hit the skyway. That's one of my experiences, and that's my biggest adult experience, is all connected to this. If you want to hear about it, I'll
Absolutely,
tell
yeah.
you about
You've got the,
it.
you know, you can take as long as you like.
Okay, well, I don't think my voice is going to last for
have a drink, have a sip.
I've been sipping water. It's not doing anything now. I began having paranormal events around my house in 1979.
Oh.
I was teaching school and raising my daughter and living with my parents, and our house was 1 block away from Tampa Bay, and which overlooked, you could see the Skyway Bridge. And so the UFO sighting of 1979, it was a summer night. My daughter and I were walking our dog in the park to the park, and there were 2 glowing white spheres that people were looking at, a small crowd in the park, hanging over Tampa Bay. So we took the dog home, raced back, and the 2 spheres were still there. They weren't weather balloons. They hadn't moved at all. And so we watched for several hours, and I decided I was communicating with one of the spheres. And I looked down, and it was gone. I looked up again, it was gone. So I felt rather insulted at that. So the second sphere was still there at 2:30 in the morning when now I kick myself. I should have stayed to see what would ever become of it. But I had to teach school in the morning, so I went home. I'd already taken my daughter home at 2:30 in the morning, and it was still there. So it wasn't a rocket test that was hanging in the air. It wasn't a Chinese lantern or a weather balloon. It was exactly where it was the whole time. And so back at my house in 1979, there were beeps in my house that had no explanation. They started in the television set. My daughter and I noticed at 5 before the hour. So I said to myself, well, there was MacDill Air Force Base over in Tampa, or some sort of timekeeping, some sort of military something was beeping in my television set. But then the beeps became random, and they showed up eventually in the wall, like a couple beeps a day. Now, how would the wall beep? There's no beep mechanism in the wall. A lamp beeped, clothes dryer beeped. I even took all sorts of appliances would just beep, and I took a cassette recorder about a half a block away, a good old-fashioned cassette recorder on batteries, and it beeped. And so that was this was also the year that I accepted being an abductee to myself. I call it my year of awakening. It was just full of strange things. So then, on May 9th, 1980, 79 turned to 1980, it was 7:33 in the morning. I was hurried, getting myself and my daughter ready for school, and our smoke alarm started to beep. Well, it had not actually been a victim of the beeps. It had never done anything odd. Of course, I raced around to check for fire and realized it wasn't the fire warning. It also wasn't really the battery low signal. And my dad said, well, it sounds almost like Morse code. And he couldn't remember. He thought he knew Morse code, couldn't remember it. And then the TV was on, and we heard at 7:35 that a barge had hit the Skyway Bridge. This was a famous disaster. The Skyway Venture barge had hit the Skyway, one span of it, because there's a left-hand lane and a whole nother bridge for the right hand. And the smoke alarm stopped, And I thought, how do I explain this? And, a Greyhound bus went over, and 35 people were killed. I think 1 or 2 cars in a Greyhound bus. And was this their energy bodies as they fell down, that somehow beeped in my smoke alarm? Well, I don't know. I mean, probably not. But it was just too strange not to be. It was exactly at the time. And then, the John Keel and the bridge disaster, the Silver Lake Bridge disaster back in the 60s, that's where the Mothman legend started. Well, in the summer of 79, I was out under the stars by myself, and the stars disappeared, and something very large went over that was opaque. It was just black overhead all of a sudden. There was a slight whooshing sound, no motor. Maybe a large seabird, but it wasn't really flapping, and it was too big for that. Anyway, it occurred to me after all this happened, gee, maybe that was Mothman. It was ringed in red, sort of a dark red around the edges, or whether it was a UFO, I'll never know. But that was my weird year of 1979, culminating in the Skyway Bridge disaster. And then the beeps trailed off. They didn't just stop, but there were fewer and fewer, and then it was over.
I was going to say, when you talk about the bridge, it had like similarities to the Mothman story.
Because that was at Christmas time. I think December 15th, and the bridge just collapsed, and I think more people were killed than the Skyway.
Yeah, it was terrible. Anyway, I can't let you go without talking about your spiritual side, because you say you've gone more in that direction. Obviously it's linked to the extraterrestrials or interdimensional people, whatever you want to call them. But your spiritual guide, do you believe that you change spiritual guides, or or does the same one stay with you all your life?
The same one whom I believe, and I'm sure within myself that I meant in those encounters, has stayed with me all my life. Myself personally, I feel that there is a shared consciousness. Whether it's a nanochip or some kind of wonderful organic telepathy, I don't know. But my life was changed at that point. I really have had different goals in life than most people, and to be honest, than most women have had. My life has been kind of like episodes of adventure, and then many years of really working hard and towing the mark and raising my daughter. And but I certainly I'm a loner as far as seeking help. I expect to be able to do everything myself, which I know as I get older.
Well, yeah, it's going to get a little bit more
cost me a problem. But he is my guide, and I've channeled I call it shared consciousness, but I've channeled for years now, for 38, 39 years. And usually it's about our species rather than individuals. Like I've worked with Tim Beckley for years as a friend and business associate, and I always said that. Now I've lost my train of thought. I had to think of Tim Beckley.
Oh yeah, I think he does. He has that effect on people.
Yeah, he does, actually. Anyway, I've always thought that, well, as Tim says, I'll just pivot here. It'll probably come back to me. That when I'm, channeling, it's for the species. Oh, I know what it was. He has always told me to, be a good psychic, and I'll say, well, Tim, I don't know if I really have the psychic ability, but what I do have is sort of rising above the trees and seeing our species as a forest and saying, if you don't, clean up your act, if you don't stop carbon emissions, whatever it is. In 1983, I was talking about torrential rainstorms and changing the climate, and we were going to regret it. So it's the messages I've given that have given comfort, and goodness, I've had such friendship from whom I call the star people. I think some people call them star seeds. But we're the star people, and it's just really a small group of a few hundred, that have stuck with me, but I am so grateful to them, and they're so enlightened and tolerant, and, they realize that science and spirit are two sides of one coin. You can't really be human, as Kirk would say, without having spirit and a bit of belief and a bit of metaphysics and a bit of superstition and all that good right brain stuff. But we also need to temper it with logic and using our intelligence and thinking things through. It's not good to just emotionally believe if somebody says, the world's flat. I know you can't just throw your whole belief into that.
Don't go down that road, please.
So that's been my, and in this book, I've actually, I worried that my readership throughout the years might think that I had gone all nuts and bolts on them and just gone totally scientific. And my last chapter proves that I have not, because, people do DNA testing to find out, maybe their great-great-grandmother survived famine and then came through Ellis Island and immigrated, and you find strength in knowing about your grandmother. You think, oh, I've got that in me. Well, we've got a bridge to the future as well as the past, and perhaps the future humans. They've never attacked us. The UFOs have never taken our planet from us, as apparently they could. Maybe that's because we're the beloved ancestors. The abductions are wrong. But I don't know as I want to go into all the abduction stuff right now, but we're not perfect. But I think that there is a bridge between, I've sort of put together my spiritual channeling, which goes a bit further, as spiritual things do, with the idea that, okay, UFOs are nuts and bolts. I don't think they're just holograms or hallucinations or lies or anything like that.
Some will be, but
yes.
not most of them, yeah.
Yeah, there is such a thing as a solid, like Jim Penniston touched the Rendlesham. There is a solid craft, and I think that we're either going to go on or we don't. And if we go on, we're going to advance some more in science and technology, and we need to fill that bridge to the future. And we're really not currently. We've kind of lost that. People so quickly will say, well, it's ETs, and not even consider the fact that in many ways it's more likely, it's easier almost, if it's us from the future.
I just thought of an interesting concept. We've got us from the future. Do you believe in reincarnation? Because, if you've got people from the future coming back and then we get reincarnated too, I just wonder how you sort of compile the two together.
Right, and that would be compiling my spiritual side or my belief side, even religious side. Yes, I believe in reincarnation, which goes with any number of religions, which I don't really follow any one. To me, I guess nature is God, because I guess I'm a pantheist, because it is so incredible and we take it for granted. And every time I step out in nature, even if it's a plain Iowa day, it just always rekindles me, and I take a deep breath and, get over all the computer stuff that's been happening. So I don't know how you feel. I'm beginning to go along the lines that actually God, or whatever you want to think of as God, is actually us, within us. And a couple of the guests I've had on previous shows, the previous last two, Michael Feely and Anthony Peake, they kind of go along that same route as well. And I'm beginning to think quite a lot in that region as well myself. We're all a spark of God. You can, and then God is within us, or goddess. I would agree, and I do believe in reincarnation. And I know Steve Boucher, who is a abductee, and his story is in my book, along with Betty Andreessen and Betty and Barney Hill and Travis Walton and me. And he says that he has felt that the UFO being he met, he had a feeling it had something to do with being him, with the reincarnated him. And I said, well, I hadn't quite worked that out with Tybus, who is the being that he never told me his name, but I gave him that name, that I channel. But I do think that, there's an aspect of that he and I are somehow the same. Yeah, I guess it would be reincarnation. Somehow have the same, essence or something. Hard to word, but definitely parallel aspects of each other, I guess I would say.
I know each show I do here, more questions come up every time, and I'll go away thinking with my head spinning most of the time.
Yeah, me too.
Anyway, I won't take up too much more of your time, but have you got any appearances? Are you speaking anywhere?
Well, I've got this animal sanctuary.
I know. I'm going to finish up on that, so don't worry.
well, I can't go. You can talk more about it, but I can't go anywhere because I really don't have anybody to leave it with long enough. I know I was asked about maybe appearing in the UK in 2022, or at some conference
let me know if you do. I mean, obviously, if you want to come back on the show at some point, and we can talk about all the abductions if you want to go in, into a deeper detail with all that.
Yes, okay, I will keep, and I would love to take a vacation. My animal sanctuary. I've been here 23 years, and I haven't gotten out of Iowa, but early in my life, I lived in the Virgin Islands and California and Amsterdam and Ireland for 5 years, and so Florida. So I really set down roots. This is where my experiences happen, my abductions. So I took that into account when I bought 10 acres, sight unseen, and the dogs and cats were my friends when I was a child. It was a lonely childhood. I was an only child. And we had this farm that my dad bought. It's close by. This isn't the exact same one. And I used to wander around nature with the dogs and the cats, and I loved it. And then when we moved to Florida, I was really traumatized. They didn't realize how much I hated to leave the land here. So I wanted to give back to the dogs and cats and not just wander around my 10 acres for the rest of my life. So I started this sanctuary. There's no shelter in this county, and shame on this county because it's a wealthy corn growing county. That's all they do is grow corporate now. Corn used to be family farmers. And the cats have nowhere, stray dogs as well, nowhere to go, and it can be 40 below zero here in it wasn't this winter, but so I did have dogs as well, but it was too much. I have my own 3 dogs, but I have 51 cats.
I was going
currently.
to ask you how many you have.
Not all in the house. I have a big heated barn, an old barn, and a new cabin, and a couple of other outbuildings, and 10 acres. So, except in the deep winter, they're free to wander on the 10 acres, and I've let it go back to the way the native people had the land, rather than I have no corn growing on my 10 acres. The sanctuary, I love it. I love them. They're my family, a large family, and I also have a daughter in San Francisco. But, it does pin me down as far as appearances. My website, earthchangepredictions.com, I can be contacted through that. There's a contact path in there if anybody would be interested. And I tried to start a new website named Teen Time Travel, but I'm not a good web builder, and it's kind of a disastrous looking site.
I suppose you have to do most of it yourself if you've got no help there.
Yeah, I didn't really want to spend the money on finding a web builder. I didn't want to. My main site, the Earth Change Predictions, is a fairly nice, complicated, older site. So Time Travel was my attempt at web building, but it's worth a look. And the book is Future Humans and the UFOs on Amazon and Kindle. Maybe you were going to say, sorry, maybe you were about to say
what I'm going to do, Diane, I'm going to put all those links on my Paranormal Dimensions page anyway. So, obviously when the show goes out, next week, it'll, all the links will be on there anyway. But I think it's very commendable to be sort of wanting to look after animals. I think most animals need it, nowadays, because there's a lot of animals that end up thrown out by people. How do you come about the cats? Do people get in touch with you knowing that you've got a sanctuary?
There's a variety of ways. The corporate farms cut all the hedgerows, and there's really no prey left for wild animal, for feral cats. It's just endless, empty fields except when it's growing corn. So, there's feral cats. Sometimes it takes me a year to make friends, and then I will, when they let me touch them, I'll nab them by the nape of the neck, throw them in a kennel, get them spayed, neutered. I've got a vet that cooperates with me.
Well, you have. I hadn't thought about that aspect. You really need to get them neutered as well, otherwise you'll be overrun by cats, won't you?
Yeah, he even gives me a discount, but I always appreciate donations because this is quite, I really invest my own money in it quite often, but people do send donations. Yeah. But then also I'll get, the vet in town, will have a cat that they just can't place, or, a cat that is abused or needs sort of extra care. It can't be a one cat that, just the whole family just, wants more of a general place it can kind of hide and recover and will be taken care of. So a number of different, places they come from. Mostly they just show up.
Really? They must have heard about you.
I know, it must be telepathic. They will get spayed or neutered and vaccinated, and also cat leukemia tested, because that's so contagious, not for people, but for cats. So I control it that way. And so anyway, that's my vet always laughs when I bring in my next victim to be spayed or neutered. And it's really a joy. I wouldn't change it, but it also keeps me active, because it is a heck of a lot of physical labor. And I have 3 big dogs as well, so.
I mean, I imagine if you've got older sick cats, you probably have some sad times as well when you've got to see them through to the end, sort of thing, as well.
It's, if I have 51 now, I must have had over time maybe 150 to, not at the same time, but I mean, I've lost, 100 and said goodbye, and it just tears me up every time.
Sure. What do you do? Do you have like an on-site graveyard, or do you, I don't quite know what you do with them?
the ground is frozen in the winter, and in mud. This is a really kind of Siberia-like. There's no nearby water that will temper, like Britain and Ireland. Ireland's further north than I am, but it was so much warmer actually. But I euthanize. I take them to the vet. But that's expensive, and the vet is 35 miles away, the vet that I use. So
it's like a 70-mile round trip then, as well.
Yes, yeah, and quite often bad weather here. But there was a pit dug at the back of my land for another reason, to bury some garbage when I couldn't pay the dumpster. Now I have a dumpster here. But when I didn't pay that, a guy dug a pit, and in desperation they go in the pit. Oh, right. But usually I do something, because it is a problem actually. Some of the dogs too that I had for years, even bigger. That was a problem.
That's what I meant when things. When you're talking to guests, so there are other things come up. You think it sort of just pops into your head. Well, I wonder what happens there, or it's. I can imagine it is a bit of a problem. But anyway, it's been so interesting, Diane. I thank you so much for coming on and telling us.
I enjoyed it.
It's very interesting hearing about that little bit on the end. I know it wasn't really paranormal, but it's an interesting aspect of looking into yourself and what you how you survive and get on and everything. But as I say, I'll certainly put your links to your books and and whatever. If you send me any links that you're interested in me putting them on the site, I will do.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
And as I say, I hope you'll come back on again and tell us more about abductions and things. And hopefully one day you'll get over to the UK. And I'll certainly be getting your book anyway.
I'd love to meet everybody, or most everybody, that I've gotten to know in the UK, which in a way is a lot more, I don't know how to word it, than the American UFO. You've got a bunch of people over there that I really admire, and I enjoy working with Phil Mantle, and I'd love to, Chris Evers, and
also, a good friend, Chris. But
I'd love to meet you all. I'll that's really on my list of, if my daughter might come back from San Francisco to take care of the animals, but she's bipolar and maybe not. I don't know if I'd feel really good leaving. She tries, but gets kind of excited to handle something like a death or something. I don't know. So anyway, I got it in the back of my mind. That would be maybe the first place I'd come and see you all.
Well, I hope so. I mean, hope you've got me as a friend now, and we'll be in touch and hopefully speak again.
Okay, great, Dave.
But,
okay, I really enjoyed it.
Oh, brilliant. I've loved having you on. You've been fascinating. Sorry.
I didn't forget too many. I always, once in a while I draw a blank as to what because I interrupt myself. But that happened too many times, so everything's good.
Well, when I was reading through this paperwork that I've got here, we sort of jump about, and you sort of kind of think, well, where are we here? It gets a bit confusing.
Right.
But
yes.
Anyway.
Well, there's in the book, it's a huge bunch of topics in the book, and it covers a lot. So, like most people for interviews probably have one, cryptoids or whatever their subject is. And this is kind of an odd, leave it to me to have an odd bunch of, the whole ball of wax.
Yeah, it's quite a big book as well, isn't it? I think it's about 300 pages?
Yeah, it's less. Two something,
almost
250 maybe.
Like that, but I'll certainly get it anyway. Anyway, Diane, thank you ever so much. I mean, you probably gasping for a drink, aren't you? If your throat's drying up.
Yeah, I'm going to eat lunch pretty soon after I do some chores here.
I'll let you get on with it. Anyway, everybody out there, thank you very much to Diane, and thanks for coming on, Diane. And we hope to see you again, hear you again. And
okay. Good.
Thank you for listening to the Paranormal Dimensions and the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm David Young. Thanks again, and tune in again next week. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Paranormal Dimensions is as bright and powerful as our celestial star, the sun. And although it's expending thousands of pounds of energy every minute of the day, have no fear. There's plenty left.
Paranormal Dimensions is a regular feature on Mondays on the Paranormal UK radio network.